So is that working? Can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes. Speak again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm very pleased to be here to be introducing Padmavajra, who, as Dharmachari said, has come here from Padmaloka via Adhisthana, where he's been recently. Padmavajra has been ordained for 40 years, so he's just celebrated his 40th anniversary of his ordination with Ramnaguna, who was also here a few weeks ago, who's a good friend to this centre. And Padmavajra's been, as you can probably tell by looking at him, he's not all that old.
Not all that old.
When you consider he's been ordained for 40 years. So Padmavajra was ordained at the tender age of 19, so Jake, you're going to have to get your skates on. He's 18.
Oh, come on.
That's why I thought you weren't here, I just thought you were rushing off to get yourself. Yes, so he's ordained at the age of 19 and he's dedicated his life to the Triratna tradition, to spreading the Dharma in this country and in India and elsewhere. So he's an incredibly dedicated career of service to the Dharma, to Triratna. And meeting Padmavajra, it's a bit like, when I meet Padmavajra, I sort of feel like I'm his best friend, which is lovely. It's a bit like I feel like that kind of friendship is extended to me, and it's a bit like being kind of, held in a warm sort of bear hug. And Padmavajra he's just a delight to be with. So we moved around town today and went to bookshops, and then he was running up and down in the road in front of my house having races against my children, whom we'd never met before.
He nearly killed himself.
But I think that sort of conveys something like Padmavajra's energy and his enthusiasm, which undimmed, as far as I can tell, from the age of 19 when he first joined the order. And I've been around him on and off for about the last 20 years since I joined the ordination process, and I've always been struck by his vigour and his enthusiasm and passion for the Dharma, and the fact that he gives the most outstanding Dharma talks. And so this is going to be recorded. I'm very, very glad to be saying, because I'm sure we'll all want to refer back to it and listen to it again. Whatever he's going to say, I don't even know if he knows what he's going to say. Maybe it's going to emerge when he starts, but I'm sure we're in for a cracker, so without any further ado, I'll hand over. Padmavajra.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Akasharaja, can you all hear me? Loud and clear, I hope?
Just about. You're too far away from that mic.
Too far away from it. What can we do about that?
I don't know unless you hold you do the hand hold.
Oh dear. Can we try?
Yeah, try.
I'll speak loudly.
Yes,
if I can.
please.
Okay.
It goes to the front.
Let's try it at the front. How's that? Is that better?
You've got to give me time.
Okay. Let's see what we can do. So yes, I'm delighted to be with you in the Shrewsbury Buddhist Centre. I feel very self-conscious about whether it's Shrewsbury and Shrewsbury or Shrewsbury, and I keep checking it, and everybody says it doesn't matter. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here in this really lovely centre, beautiful centre. It's the first time I've come to Shrewsbury as well. I've never been here before, so I was very glad that Akasharaja took me around town today, and it's such a lovely town. Really, it was just such an interesting place. lots of interesting buildings. So I felt very, very good being here, and Jess being with Akasha Raja and with his family and with Padmavajra and the boys. That was very lovely. And but just so amazing coming here, coming down that road and coming into the centre here. And I can see that this centre's been created with a lot of love. I mean, it really does. It really does show. I was talking to John earlier, and he was telling me a bit about the conversion work and the decorating and everything else, and it really does feel like a very, very loved place. So already there's a very lovely atmosphere here. So it's very inspiring to see that happening, and to come into a really positive and energetic, friendly sangha. I gather the centre has won an award as well. The mayor has some sort of community project award.
It was for the building.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I really feel very proud of that. Proud to be in a community which a spiritual community, a Buddhist community, which has that kind of impact on the world around, because that's so important. That sometimes people think that Buddhists and Buddhism is something that hermits do, and Buddhists are just concerned with themselves and sort of gazing at their navel and simply meditating. But Buddhism is about living. It's about living a life. It's not simply, when we say practice, I feel a little bit uncomfortable when people talk about my practice, because it can sometimes just be associated with meditation. And it's much more than that. Buddhism is a life. Our ordination in the Triratna Buddhist order is the Dharmachari or Dharmacharini, the feminine form ordination, which means a Dharmachari is one who lives the Dharma life. Dharmacharini is someone who lives the Dharma life in body, speech and mind. All aspects of life should be included within that. And you can see that reflected here in this place. And I think you must have been celebrating Buddha Day, Vaishakha Purnima, the full moon of Vaishak, as it's traditionally called, the anniversary of the Buddha's enlightenment. I can see this very lovely representation of the Bodhi tree. I was really admiring that. I like canopies. I think canopies are very, very lovely things. Very interesting as well. That image, I don't know if you know this, is actually at Padmaloka where I live. The original painting of that, which is much bigger, is in one of our shrine rooms at Padmaloka, and it used to be right at the centre of our main shrine. So it was lovely seeing that there, and that is really depicting the Buddha at the time of his enlightenment, seated on a seat of grass, meditating. And the artist, who's a very good friend of mine, Arloka, one of our order members, one of the things I said to him when we commissioned him to do the painting, I said, I'd like you to paint the Buddha as our teacher, Sangharakshita, evokes him when he evoked him in a seminar he did on a very early Buddhist collection called the Udana, which begins with descriptions of the Buddha's enlightenment, with the Buddha seated under the Bodhi tree and other trees in the vicinity, enjoying the bliss of liberation, the sukha vimoksha, after seeing into the depths of existence, seeing things as they really are, and through that seeing becoming completely liberated from all mental bonds whatsoever. What opened up was the bliss of liberation, the deep welling happiness that comes when you're free, or the bliss that is actually liberation and freedom. And I think this is a very, very significant little detail that very easily gets passed over when people speak about the life of the Buddha, speak about Buddhism. enlightenment, the Buddha's enlightenment is bliss. It's liberation, it's bliss. It's deep welling happiness. If you want the highest, deepest possible bliss, the greatest kind of ecstasy, you've got to gain enlightenment. Nothing else will do. If you're, any sort of young people into ecstatic stuff, you've got to go for, or older people for that matter, you've got to go for enlightenment. That is the bliss. That is the bliss that never comes to an end. That is the fullness of satisfaction. And I think this is really important because you probably know that if you've read any books on Buddhism, if you've studied the Dharma, or you hear people talking about it, very often you hear about the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha discovers: dukkha, suffering. All life is suffering. That's often how it's explained. And the cause of that suffering is our deep craving and attachment. Trishna, thirst. And yes, there's an end to it. That's nirvana. And there's a path to the end of it. That's the Eightfold Path. But when people see that word dukkha, sometimes they think, Buddhists, they must be very pessimistic people, always talking about suffering, all life is suffering. And even some people who are Buddhists, they start thinking that, it's only real unless it hurts. Then you're a really deep person. Depth is really talking about your pain and bringing out your pain, and everybody going on about their pain. And that means you must be a really deep person if you talk about your pain and open up about it and all the rest of it. Well, actually, the deeper you go, the higher you go, the further you go, the more bliss, the more satisfaction, the more happiness will arise for you. It doesn't mean that you're free, of course, of physical pain and things like that. That goes with the territory of being embodied. We don't get round that. But you have a completely different attitude and relationship, to that side of things. But internally, there is deeper and deeper happiness and satisfaction. So I thought that I'd like to talk to you about bliss. I'd like to talk to you about happiness. I'd like to talk to you about pleasure, because it's a very important part of Buddhist practice and isn't often explored. It's actually a very important realization of the Buddha before his enlightenment. You probably, if you know the life of the Buddha, you probably know that he spent all those years, I think people think it's about 6 years, doing those severe ascetic practices, those terrible austerities, trying to see into the truth, to break through, to be liberated through starving himself, all sorts of privations, not washing, not eating, not sleeping, holding his breath for ages until his ears started ringing, and so on and so forth. This was an ancient Indian, it's still a current Indian tradition, that severe asceticism, severe penance, if you like, will lead to liberation. And after 6 years, he realised he was dying, and he was actually no nearer the truth. And it's very interesting what happened at that moment of crisis. What came to his rescue? What came to his rescue was his memory. Memory is such a wonderful thing. Often we have bad memories, don't we? And we can often feel cursed by the memories we might have. But memory also works in another way. And the word for memory is smriti, which also means mindfulness. But originally smriti, mindfulness, the Buddhist word for mindfulness, is just remembering, remembering what life is really for, what it's about. And remembering your beginnings, especially the beginnings of your spiritual search. And the Buddha went back in his memory to when he was 16, something like that, and he remembered an early and very important, or for want of a better word, spiritual experience, where he was sitting beneath what's called a rose apple tree, a jambu tree, and he spontaneously entered into a state of meditation. It was very pleasurable, very blissful, very expansive. Some accounts of that particular story say it happened when he was watching an old man, weathered and worn, ploughing a field with, the oxen ploughing the field, looking very, very tired and toiling, and the earth being ripped up and all of the, worms and insects being broken. And he felt this tremendous compassion for the scene, and kind of out of that compassion withdrew, as it were, into another state, and what opened up was a sort of bliss, a higher state of consciousness. He remembered that, and he reflected, well, when I was that age, I wasn't starving myself. I wasn't putting myself through all these trials and tribulations. I was young, I was healthy. And then he had this reflection. He reflected that one of the things he'd been doing, he'd thought that the pleasure that comes from skillfulness, from acting ethically, from wholesome states, free of greed, hatred, delusion, filled with, love and so on, skillful states, the pleasure that came from that should be rejected. That all pleasure was somehow wrong. All pleasure was somehow ensnaring. And he reflected, well, no. The pleasure that came from these wholesome states of mind, like metta, like mindfulness and so on, that's important. There's something in that pleasure. So he took solid food. He decided, well, let's get my body strong again. He took milk rice and so on, and he cleaned himself up. And he started to look at the whole area of pleasure that arises from wholesome states of mind. And he realised that this kind of pleasure is really important for the mind. It refreshes the mind, invigorates the mind. It's like inspiration. When you feel inspired, you feel that your whole psychophysical system is sort of enriched and invigorated, and you can move on, if you like. So he entered into some very deep meditative states. But he had this sort of realisation that he should enjoy the pleasure in these deep meditative states, but not get attached to that pleasure. He seemed to know that, no, let's not get caught up in that. Let's not get stuck in the pleasure of one particular meditative state. Let's hold lightly to it. And of course, lo and behold, holding lightly to it opened up an even deeper pleasure, an even greater pleasure, all the way up actually to enlightenment. It's a very, very important passage describing, if you like, what the Dharma life is really like, where you enjoy the fruits that come from your meditation, or your ethical practice, or your studies, or your spiritual friendship, but you don't get attached to it. You don't cling to it. You allow it to unfold into something greater. So this is a very important passage, because it's clear that the pleasure is like his fuel. He's got his vision, his sort of wisdom, if you like, or the beginnings of his wisdom, seeing into the future almost, seeing into the depths of reality, but bringing him along is this body of pleasure which is continually refreshing him and renewing him. It's very, very important, this particular aspect of things. So I want to see how we can use pleasure in our own Dharma life, in our own life. Such an important area. And it's related so much to happiness, to well-being, to that whole area of self-metta that often comes up, care of the self. We need to have a good look into that. And I'm going to do that by using a traditional list, but a list you might not have heard of because it's rather obscure. It comes from the Buddhist Tantric tradition, comes from an obscure Tantric text. Tantric Buddhism arose somewhere in around the 6th century in Indian Buddhism. A continuation of the Buddha's teachings, but responding to changing circumstances. And this is the teaching of the four anandas, the four pleasures, the four joys, the four happinesses. So the first level is called ananda, and that's just straightforward pleasure, joy, happiness. Then there's what's known as paramananda, which is perfect joy or happiness. Then there's viramananda. Sorry, is that the right word? Viramananda, which means the pleasure, the joy that comes from liberation. And then there's sahajananda, which means spontaneous pleasure and joy, spontaneous happiness, the highest happiness of all. So I want to go through each of these and see how we can apply them to our own circumstances. I'm not going to say how it all works out from the tantric text. That is too wacky and weird to go into. But it's a really good teaching, I think, and worth looking into. So let's look at ananda. Ananda can be translated as bliss, happiness, or joy. Any of those. It's quite a loose word. And what this level is the pleasure that comes through ordinary, embodied sense experience. Buddhism isn't afraid of that kind of pleasure. But it's very important to refine the sources of sense pleasure, and of course to engage in the sources of sense pleasure that don't ensnare you, that don't bring out excessive attachment and addiction and those kinds of problems that can often happen with, when we're into pleasurable things. Because I don't know about you, when I have a pleasurable experience, I want to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until it's not very pleasurable anymore and becomes something else. I won't go into that. But there is a way in which we can enjoy the pleasures of the senses in a way that doesn't ensnare us. So this is, I think, where, the pleasure, for example, of nature. Let's just start there. Really enjoying the natural world. The Buddhist tradition is really not afraid of this. The Buddha himself, sometimes when you read descriptions of the Buddha, you especially if he's giving a stern teaching to one of his disciples, you think, this is a bit severe, and you think he might be a bit of a killjoy. Some of these old translations especially, he sounds almost like a sort of Protestant preacher or something like that. But there are plenty of passages in the Pali texts where the Buddha it's clear that he loves the natural world. There's a very, very beautiful passage at the end of his life when he's an old man of 80, on his last tour, and he's in this great city of Vaishali. And Vaishali was famous for its shrines to nature spirits, to yakshas, these very powerful nature spirits. And he's sitting with Ananda, interestingly enough, his disciple, and he's saying to Ananda, delightful Ananda are the shrines of Vaishali, the shrine of the 7 mangoes, wonderful names. I can't remember all the names now, but they were groves of trees, sacred groves, and the Buddha would like to sit in these places, just enjoying the peace, the serenity, and the loveliness of these trees. And the loveliness of the atmosphere. We're very familiar with this, aren't we? When I was coming on the train from Ledbury today, I couldn't help but noticing. I thought, is that a burial mound on top of that hill there, and passing all this wonderful rolling countryside, which you could sort of feel the layers of history even on the train. And there's a wonderful sort of feeling just looking out of the train window at all this green, and I sort of wanted the train to stop so I could sort of run off and go into some of these groves. So this is really, really important that we go into nature and not just look at it and immediately take a photograph with our iPhone and put it on Facebook and say, look at the lovely trees. Forget all that. Leave all that junk at home. Go into those spaces and just be there. Be there. Be a pagan. Our teacher Sangharakshita once said, he said, a pagan is somebody who experiences nature directly and feels that they are part of that nature. We are part of the natural world. We are part of that. I think a lot of the problems that people experience, especially in the cities, the big cities, the alienation, is because they're not having that direct experience anymore of being a natural being in the natural world, and just that straightforward sense pleasure that comes from trees and leaves and plants and grass and stones and rock and rain and wind and sun. Flowers, Adhisthana, the flowers are stunning there. You can get over there at the moment before the rain finishes them off. So yes, nature, very, very important, that sense of pleasure coming from that. And we need to make that a practice. We need to make that central to our lives. And then another aspect of pleasure is people. The beauty of people. Again, going back to the Buddha's parinirvana, there's another wonderful moment, again in Vaishali, where all of the youths, as they're called in the text, the Kumaras, have all turned up to see the Buddha, and they're all lads, and they're wearing the latest fashions of Vaishali, which seems to consist of the text says, so some of them are wearing blue clothes and blue makeup. Some of them are wearing yellow clothes and yellow makeup. Some of them are wearing white clothes and white makeup. And some of them are wearing red clothes and red makeup. And I think there's red jewels and blue jewels and yellow jewels. I mean, they're the dudes, basically, of that time. And there they are. They've all come to see the Buddha. They've turned out. And the Buddha is sitting there, and he just sees them coming. It's an amazing sight. They're probably kind of like young peacocks strutting around or something like that. Well, they want to see the Buddha, the great teacher. They want to get his blessing, take his darshan, get some of his magic. And the Buddha sees them and he says, monks, monks, if you've never seen the heaven of the 33 gods, look at these young men. They're just like that. And it's an immediate response to the beauty of these young men. There's nothing funny going on with the Buddha's description. He's able to appreciate this amazing sight. He doesn't say, look at these ridiculous young men dressed up like this. No, he sees their wonderful sort of youth and colour and confidence and energy, and it's inspiring. It's uplifting. It's pleasurable. So yes, we can enjoy one another, but perhaps more importantly, when we talk about the pleasure that comes through the senses, is spiritual friends, sangha, community, meeting spiritual friends. The pleasure, regardless of what we're wearing and how we're dressed and how we're turned out and our age and all the rest of it. The enjoyment that comes through being with fellows, with one another on the Dharma path, in the Dharma life. There is something really pleasurable about that. It's not just very supportive and helpful. It's incredibly enjoyable. It's incredibly satisfying to be together. Enjoying one another in inspired, mutually inspired, through living the Dharma life. The Buddha is very clear about this in the Dhammapada. There's a whole chapter on sukha, on happiness. Happy indeed we live, friendly amid the haters. Among those who hate, we dwell free from hate. And other verses like this. So, also making the point that there's a connection between happiness, bliss, and friendliness. When you can be together with friends, it makes you happy. On a quite ordinary sort of level. I mean, it's lovely hearing the announcements you had about breathworks and the shrine rota, very pleasurable thing to do, and the vegan feast just people coming together in these kinds of ways. You know, we're not always crunching the gears in terms of meditation and hour after hour, coming together as human beings in a friendly and enjoyable way with people who care about us and who we care about. That's very, very pleasurable and very important, and it fuels us in the Dharma life. I think one of the things that people often forget, Buddhists often forget, is how conditional Dharma practice is. We tend to think it's entirely dependent on our willed effort and doing the meditation techniques and following the ethical path and really going for it. Well, that's important. We need to make an effort, but it's very, very dependent on the togetherness and the support, the inspiration, the instruction, the helpfulness of friends who are also practicing. It's one of the things I find I ordain people. I'm a preceptor in our order. And one of the things that I notice with some of the people I've ordained, that they often forget this. They often forget to meet with spiritual friends. And they come to me on retreat and they say, you know, I've forgotten, you know, why I'm doing this. You know, I've sort of lost my way. But actually I've remembered it coming on retreat. And being here, I've remembered what it is I'm supposed to be doing. And I say, well, maybe you ought to think about that. You know, why didn't you put it together? When was the last time you were on retreat? About 5 years ago. And you think, well, you know, you're really missing something. You know, you're missing that support from spiritual friends. And, you know, we need that. We all need that. I need that. And I've been doing this for a long time. And also it's just enjoyable. It's just delightful being with friends in the Dharma life. So that's the first level of pleasure, and it never goes away. You know, the Buddha was enlightened and he could still enjoy the pleasures that come through the senses. He doesn't reject those in any way. He has a heightened sense of the pleasures that come through the senses. But then there's this Viramananda, which is Paramananda, which is it's called perfect happiness. Or perhaps you could say more perfect happiness. This is the pleasure that comes from deep meditation, that comes from what's called dhyana, absorption. This is the pleasure that comes where you're starting to, as it were, turn away from the outer world in a gentle, refined kind of way. You've refined your experience of sense pleasure, and you're discovering the sort of inner world there is an even deeper pleasure and satisfaction, and it's welling up from inside yourself. And of course this comes from the development of skillful states of mind. As I said earlier, it doesn't come just through sort of straining to get it, through some sort of bliss button that you press yogically, some sort of chakra that you knock and suddenly you're there with a minimal amount of effort. No, it comes out of skillfulness. I think Kanyana Kumara was talking about this the other day, he was telling me. So it comes out of ethical practice, which of course we do in our ordinary daily life. We're aiming to, let's just take this example of metta bhavana. We've done that practice tonight. People sometimes struggle with metta bhavana. I don't know why. I mean, I love metta bhavana. It doesn't mean I'm always mettaful in my daily life, but I really enjoy the metta bhavana. But really, for successful metta, that loving kindness, the loving kindness needs to be going on throughout the day. We need to be turning our mind to that awareness, and it is an awareness, a mindfulness of loving kindness in all we do. Much greater awareness of other people, being more generous with people, more considerate to other people, and of course taking good care of ourselves, not leaving ourselves out of that, doing the things that we need to do to make sure that we're taking proper care of the self, so resting properly, not overdoing it, making sure after a day's work that we do rest, looking after our health, exercise, all those things, really looking after ourselves, and of course not getting into anxious, aversive sort of states, but filling our mind, yes, with with loving kindness and extending that to others and living meaningfully. It's very, very important if we're concerned about our proper care of the self and that first stage of the metta. We need to live meaningfully. I think very often people have trouble with that first stage of the metta bhavana because on a certain level they don't feel they're living entirely meaningfully. They're not paying attention to what is really important in their life. Maybe they're fitting in too much with other people's expectations. So you have to ask yourself, how can I be more meaningful in my life? Or another thing, just to say, while we're on the subject of, goodness me, time's running out. On the subject, what time do I finish? Half past. Goodness, I better get a move on. But this is important. Sometimes I think people, with the first stage of the metta bhavana, they have trouble with it because they haven't done a proper investigation into their day. They can feel just sort of bad. And actually, well, take a look. Have you behaved well that day? And you might go through and think, well, actually, I have. I've been really helpful to people today. Is there anything in your conscience that you need to reproach yourself for? It's a very important question. I think very often people are reproaching themselves for something they haven't done. They've just got into a habit of self-reproach. Really weird. Why would you do that? That's weird. You wouldn't do it with other people. Why do you do it with yourself? So check it out. Feeling good about yourself comes from a clear conscience. When you have a clear conscience, as I'm sure Kanyana Kumara told you, you start feeling joyful. You start feeling happy. I've got nothing to reproach myself for. So anyway, coming back to not carrying on with the subject, the deep meditative states of bliss really arise out of skillfulness. The more skillful you are in your day, the happier, the deeper the happiness you'll experience in meditation. And one of the wonderful things when you read and have a feeling for the descriptions of higher meditative states is that it isn't just one bliss, one happiness. There's lots of different words that are used to describe this, all sorts of subtle and all sorts of flavours, and I think we really do need to use poetry here, perfumes and sort of different sort of senses that you sort of experience in deeper meditation. I don't know if any of you listen to music. I don't know if you've listened. I was listening with Ratnaguna on our order birthday celebrations to Olivier Messiaen. Anybody know Messiaen's music? Great French composer. Well, he's a very ecstatic composer, but you have this sense, very Christian, very Catholic, that you have this sense of somebody who knows all these different sort of aspects of ecstasy and bliss, and you really get the sense of somebody who knows about deeper kind of mystical experience. Well, the deeper dhyana experiences are like that. Another thing that's going on with that is expansion. It's very, very important. One of the things about pleasure, and one of the reasons why I think it's so important to us, is that you have a sense of expansion. When you do the metta bhavana, one of the reasons why the metta bhavana can be pleasurable is because your consciousness is expanding. It's starting to connect much more widely. It's much less self-focused. It's much less rigid. There's a kind of melting and expansion. Actually, all pleasurable experience, when you look into it, there is a kind of expansion. But for lasting pleasure, you need to do something like metta. You really do need to do the metta bhavana to embrace more people. There's something about being empathic, being sympathetic, that is intensely pleasurable. You're going out of yourself. You're forgetting yourself. I think the word for ecstasy, it comes from the Greek, doesn't it? And it means a standing outside of yourself. And that's a lovely, to stand outside of yourself for a while, to forget yourself, is an immensely pleasurable experience. You're much less self-centred, you're much less bothered. You start experiencing liberation, which is the next of the anandas, viramananda, the bliss of liberation. the bliss of liberation, the bliss of the dissolving of what William Blake calls the mind-forged manacles. In the bliss of liberation, you really are getting rid of them. The thing about the bliss that goes with dhyana and meditation, it can be won and lost, as I'm sure you might have experienced. You might have at a class or on a retreat or even at home had a really good meditation, and you say to your friends at the centre, perhaps the order members, I know now, this is it. I've discovered it. And of course the next time you meditate, it's gone. It's vanished. You think, well, where did that go? What, this is like, develop doubt. Well, it's because it's very conditioned. It's dependent on particular conditions. One of the conditions it depends on, especially if you're a newer person, is your beginner's mind. And if any of you have had that experience when you first did it, wow, a great opening, because there was no preconception. You were just open and you were attentive. So it just really opened up. But then after a while you become very habitual and very sort of stuck and all the rest of it. Everybody's nodding. Because it is very conditioned. But what you've got to do with meditation, every time you meditate, you need to meditate fresh. You need to be curious, be open. Don't let the mind-forged manacles condition the way you actually meditate. Be open to the changes. Because one of the things about the bliss of liberation, if we want to keep it really simple, it arises from insight into impermanence, into change, into the constant flow and change of things. Sometimes when we talk about impermanence, we tend to concentrate on loss. If we see impermanence, it's all about, I'm going to die, they're going to die, we're going to lose this. And, after a while of hearing a talk on impermanence, you sort of think, might as well not bother with this. But impermanence is neutral. Impermanence doesn't. As David Hockney once said, the good times don't last forever, the bad times don't last forever. Everything is in constant flux and change, and because of that, it means liberation is possible. It means that you don't have to get caught up in your old stories, in your old habits. You can be open to the freshness of experience. So when the Buddha enjoys the bliss of liberation beneath the Bodhi tree, it's partly to do with seeing the freshness of things. Everything is constantly in a state of arising and ceasing. And that is liberating. That is liberating. It means everything is open. You might have come across this word, shunyata, which is often translated as emptiness. But one quite eccentric but very important scholar, Herbert Gunther, translates this, renders shunyata as the open dimension of being. The open dimension of being. Being is not closed. Life, reality isn't closed. It's always open. It's always opening up. If we could just see it as doing that all the time. We don't have to close things down. And that's liberating. And that's blissful. 2 minutes to go. Which is good, because I'm going to talk about the highest possible bliss that comes from this particular tantric tradition, Sahajananda. Sahaja means natural, can be translated as innate, but I think that's a bit misleading. Natural, spontaneous, uncontrived. So Sahajananda means the bliss that is spontaneous, natural, uncontrived. And this is really, we can't really say anything about this kind of bliss. So everything I say is wrong. There's a verse that describes it, a very cryptic verse, but a verse that I really love, which comes from the origin of this particular tradition of the blisses, the pleasures. It goes something like this. It's a sort of said from deep realization. No beginning, no in-between, no end, no existence, no stopping. Oh, in that supreme great bliss, There is no self, there is no other. So what this tradition I think is getting at is that it's more like your entire experience, outside and inside, is just bliss. It's just bliss. It's just this deep, deep happiness, this deep well-being. And you make no distinction between your happiness and the happiness of others, because there is in this no self and no other. That's been dissolved in this bliss. So in this sense, bliss is the same as love and compassion. When you experience this kind of bliss, when this bliss opens up, there is then just spontaneous, compassionate activity. This is the bliss of the Buddha. This is the constant bliss of the Buddha. He doesn't see any distinction between his enlightened bliss and, if you like, the emerging bliss in other living beings, because all the Buddha sees is our potential for Buddhahood. If the Buddha was to come into the Shrewsbury Buddhist Centre now, he wouldn't be seeing us as we're seeing each other. He'd be seeing us entirely differently. He'd be seeing us as emerging Buddhas. That's what he'd see, just like the lotuses that he sees in that great vision after his enlightenment, emerging up out of the mud of the pond. He would be seeing that. He would be tuning into that. He would be seeing that potential for this great bliss, and he would be drawing it out. When you hear the word compassion, you mustn't think that the Buddha is going around all the time thinking, oh, people are suffering, I'm so sad. That's not what it is. That's not what the Buddha's compassion really is. It's something incredibly positive. Having this incredible positive vision of human beings, seeing their emergence, their flourishing, their potential for flourishing and maturing, and doing everything he can to bring that about. So it's also the Buddha's great skillful means, his great wisdom. He can tune into anybody where they are and can draw out exactly what they need to fulfill themselves through the path of pleasure and bliss, even to that ultimate bliss where there is no self, there is no other. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Speak. Me. No. It's one of those talks, isn't it, where I just felt it was just being addressed at me. Saying, Akasha Raja, you've got to get on with it, you've got to sort of, rediscover that sense of bliss, that sense of enjoyment, that sense of pleasure. That can so easily get kind of fall by the wayside as one goes about the sort of duties and obligations of daily life. I think that's a very, very timely reminder, and in a way of something which is very, very obvious, that the spiritual life is supposed to be pleasurable. Dharma life needs to be pleasurable, and if it's not, then what are we doing? So I think we can take this talk as a really, really positive and entertaining spur to greater heights of pleasure and enjoyment of each other and of everything we do in the Dharma life. So once again, thanks very much, Padmavajra. Another round of applause.